Welcome to Cannabis 360, your source for cannabis and psychedelic industry news, interviews, and insights. Visit canna360.ca and sign up to receive free access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog. In this episode of High Fidelity, we speak with Mika Unterman, founder and president of Apical Ethical Cannabis Collective. Mika provides an overview of corporate social responsibility, how consumer values have shifted based on demographics of cannabis users, and covers the major challenges implementing sustainability practices in the cannabis industry and how taking an ethical approach will have a positive impact on a company's bottom line and help them save money long term. All right, well, thank you for joining me today, Mika. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yeah, can't complain. It's a beautiful day out here. So excited to get into this conversation about ESG and the cannabis industry and how it relates. So I wanted to start off first. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, how you got started in the cannabis industry, and what led you to starting Apical Ethical Cannabis Collective?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I kind of took a roundabout way into the cannabis industry. I graduated university with a degree in Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, which doesn't really serve me very well in my current role. But after I left university, I started teaching people how to use software. So I was an instructional designer for about 6 years. And that sort of really easily segued for me into teaching people about cannabis. I taught people how to use software. It was very easy for me to gather information about using cannabis and help people and empower them to use it as their medicine. So we talked about anything from, what is THC and how do you titrate up all the way through to how do you make your own suppositories, which is a joke I like to tell. It's just some IKEA ice trays and some coconut oil and you're good to go. So if you want to talk about that later, we can do that. And what ended up happening is I was hired by a largely pharmaceutical company with a lot of pharma background that had created an extraction facility, CO2 extraction. And ultimately they had all of the technical knowledge to actually create these products, but they didn't have that overarching understanding of what is this product? How can it be used? What are its many variations? And so as a result, I ended up kind of being in a position to project manage the creation of new SKUs, which is how I ended up in ops. So my most recent role was Director of Business Development and Commercialization. Over my 5 years in ops and cannabis, I've launched over 60 SKUs in the market. So what we do is we start and we say, what does the market want and need? Where are there gaps that we can fill with our competitive advantage? How do we charge for this? What should we charge for this? What's the margin on it? Then how do we get all these materials here? How do we make it? All the way through to let's negotiate with the boards, let's deliver it, let's ensure that we have consistent supply. So I've been doing that. 60 SKUs is a lot of SKUs to do that for. And ultimately, I feel like that is what has empowered me to be in the role that I am today. Being so conscious of how these things get put to market meant that I understand the process most people go through to launch a new SKU. And that process doesn't include right now, what are the environmental thresholds that we're dealing with, meaning what is the max capacity of our planet and our local ecosystem, and what are the societal needs, the minimum of which we need to meet for everybody to feel empowered, valued, and like they're contributing to the end goal. Those just weren't questions that were asked ever. And they're questions that I ask myself on my personal life. And I really wanted to ask them in my professional life and was not given the latitude really to do that. And I don't think most people right now in operations in cannabis are given the latitude to do that, which is why I founded Apical. It started as a dinner series where I was basically just listening to these executives and thought leaders in the space and asking why isn't this a priority? What's challenging about it? Why haven't you done this? And then Apical was born in November of 2021 as a full-time gig for me. I mean, I founded it in 2019, but to really empower these companies to demonstrate to them that profitability and sustainability, they're not separate. They can absolutely jive together because sustainability methodology is lean methodology, which everybody wants to achieve today. And so that's what I'm here doing.
That's really cool. So sort of, getting that experience on the operation side, launching all of these SKUs, going through that product development process really sort of gave you that hands-on look in terms of what this process actually looks like. But then also too, sort of, again, all the problems that come with that potentially as well. And how do we, embed sustainability into that basically? Am I getting that right?
You got it. And I think the sustainability lens for me is something that I share with many millennials and Gen Zers, which is like climate anxiety and the anti-work movement, I suppose. And just feeling like, is this the world that we want to live in? And the answer for me was no. And how do I change that? And that's why Apical was born.
That's amazing. And I want to like dive into that sort of the demographics and stuff. But before we get into that, can you briefly, so what the main thing I wanted to talk with you about today and sort of what I see you sharing a lot on LinkedIn, which I find really valuable, is this conversation around ESG, or environmental, social, and government. So can you just briefly explain to the audience what that is, and what's it all about basically?
Yeah, and there are so many acronyms. So I'll, beyond just doing ESG, I'll kind of show you how all these things connect. So ESG is environmental social governance, and that is a term that we largely use with investors. So the difference between a lot of these acronyms is merely the audience. And ESG essentially means that we are monitoring and measuring our non-financial capital. So our environmental capital, our human capital, and I can give you examples of those in a minute, and then presenting that to investors as a way to demonstrate how we perform, not just on a financial level, but on an environmental level and on a social level. An example of environmental capital is our greenhouse gas emissions or lack thereof. An example of social capital is the percent of promotions this year that were female or BIPOC or LGBTQ. So those are the kinds of metrics that we can present to investors and say, look how good we're doing. Like, we are a conscious company and we make these decisions in order to benefit all of these different areas and not just drive profitability. Another term that we see commonly used is CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And again, it's fundamentally the same thing. We're talking about how can a corporation really be responsible? How can it act ethically within environmental and planetary thresholds and meeting societal needs? But it's more action oriented. So when we think about CSR, we often think about what is the company doing? How do we improve those metrics, not just report on them? And so that's kind of how CSR fits into this game. But ultimately, are they two sides of the same coin? Absolutely. What we're talking about here is our non-financial capital. How do we make sure that we measure our progress and success as a business, not just in terms of dollar amounts?
Yeah, and I think I've heard you speak on this too, sort of that this is always just viewed in terms of just a financial or risk lens. And so how can ESG sort of be something that's viewed outside of just that?
Well, it's interesting because in order to get most people to think about ESG, you have to talk about it in a risk lens. That is what they care about right now. So you have to meet people where they're at. And for the cannabis companies that exist today, that's what they care about. They want to know about price volatility, supply chain risk, risk management from a reputation perspective. These are the terms that I use to get attention from the audience that I need to get attention from. But what is the next iteration of that? It is a company that is purpose driven. So when we think about what we want our organizations to achieve, that is the next version of this, where we move beyond risk, we move beyond just like saving our own asses and into this, how can my company, weed producer that it is, retailer that it is, right? These are not like, we're not like creating new solar energy or like reinventing any cool, amazing carbon capture technology. We're growing weed, we're selling weed, but that doesn't mean that we can't be purpose driven. And so when we are purpose driven, we're thinking about those environmental thresholds, those societal needs. And every choice that we make is about balancing financial and non-financial capital all the time.
Yeah, I think that is really an interesting approach that you take, where you sort of try to meet people where they're at now, right? And framing that in the lens of sort of like, I think I've heard you speak of it in terms of like identifying growth opportunities, right? And this being sort of part of that and not separate from it. A lot of people want to separate them out and say, okay, you know, corporate social responsibility and, you know, financial gain and benefit are two completely separate things, but you're very clear in terms of being like, no, these are interconnected.
They're absolutely interconnected if you think about it long enough, right? And I think that's, there are two things that I hear that prevent people from adopting it. They don't have time to think about it, and therefore they don't want to think about it. And so when you set up a recycling program very quickly and you don't think about the implications long term, well, of course, it's going to be just a black hole for cash in terms of managing your finances, because it's not linked strategically to the business. And the other side is that people don't really understand what sustainability is quite yet. And that's because sustainability isn't a specific thing. It's kind of a movement. Pardon. So when we think about sustainability, we have to be really, really specific about what we mean, because when I talk about a waste audit and how there are opportunities for revenue that are currently being thrown in the garbage and that you're paying to haul away, when we think about opportunities in your garbage that you're kind of paying to haul away, all of a sudden they're like, oh, I would love to consider that. I didn't know that there was cash in my garbage. And when we think about much bigger projects than that, like solar energy, and how we can install solar panels on our roof to mitigate our energy costs, which are a huge cost for the business. Again, that's margin. That's all about cost savings. And so that's what I talk about all the time. Is like, you can't do everything. You can't be everything to everybody. You can do things that strategically make sense for your business, but hey, also have environmental and social benefits.
Absolutely. And to sort of go back on what you were saying earlier in terms of sort of this, you know, our generation, I feel like we like are almost the seminal documentary, at least, you know, growing up for me, was like An Inconvenient Truth, you know what I mean? Like, big shout out to that. I think in terms of getting that on everyone's like mind, right? And I think it really had an impact. And so in terms of like our demographics and age groups and sort of the age group of consumers of cannabis, you know, why do you think ESG is important to us? And are you seeing sort of a generational shift in terms of that consumer value?
It's such a big question, and I love it. Why do I think younger generations care more about this right now than older generations? Simply put, we have longer to live on this planet. And the tipping points environmentally that we're reaching are so close. And one big one is CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere, where the threshold of danger is 450 parts per million. And this is not meant to be a weed joke, but we are at 420 parts per million right now in the atmosphere. So we're really reaching a threshold of danger and have more science to support this, and more accurate observation and reporting and tracking measures than we have ever had before, and better distribution for this information. And so, yeah, it's something that we receive messages about all the time, which creates anxiety, it creates worry. The sad thing for me about this whole thing is that ultimately we started noticing the effects of climate change in the 1920s. And yet still very, very little was done to address that. And I think a lot of that has to do with how business is taught, especially in the MBA side of things, where you don't really hear about ESG, or you didn't until very recently. You're not taught to manage your non-financial capital. And so now we're going through this generational shift where we all feel the pressure of either our own burnout and working environments, or the planetary needs and seeing increased wildfires, higher temperatures, floods, landslides, all of these things. And so now we are asking for that education more and more, and it's being given to us. Hopefully it's not too late.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, something that, at least for me, that's interesting with cannabis, and especially like legalization, that it was talked about as a movement. And like you just said, like sustainability as well as a movement. And I think, like Greenpeace and sort of the cannabis movement have always been integrated a little bit, right? In a way. So it sort of makes sense that these things do go hand in hand.
I absolutely agree. And I think the reason why we're seeing that is currently not the case is because of the way the industry was financed upon legalization. And I often talk about this, how pre-legalization, cannabis was about compassion. It was about medicine. It was about support. It was about community. Retailers were not dispensaries, they were compassion clubs, because they were about creating support and helping each other. And then we got financed by venture capital, by Bay Street, and the values of that money were not aligned with the values of this community, which is why we have this corporate cannabis that people really don't want to touch.
Yeah, it is. It is something that feels exactly like you said. Sort of, we started off on this path, and it's been tough to sort of pull it back ever since. But hopefully things are getting better on that front. I mean, I remember me personally, one of the first sort of things that I saw related to cannabis and sustainability was a TED Talk by Dan Sutton talking about just the environmental impact of just cultivating cannabis, period. And doesn't feel like we've come that far since then, right? Unfortunately.
Well, I think cannabis is running into the same challenges that every other CPG and ag company is also facing, which is why the author of Triple Bottom Line, and now for the life of me, his name escapes me, but hopefully you can add that in the editing. So the author who came up with Triple Bottom Line concept, 10 years later, actually retracted what he was saying, because he mentioned that he saw more people reporting and observing what was happening, and not enough people taking action as a result of that report. So right now, and I talk about non-financial capital management all the time, which is, it is in and of itself reporting, but ultimately with the end of wanting to take action. And that action feels overwhelming for an individual, for a company, and that's because we are not in a place in our industry where we're being collaborative, where we're working together. We're really competitive very early on. And so, yeah, one company cannot tackle all of these things. And so we haven't seen a lot of progress because we haven't seen a lot of coalition building that's focused less on lobbying and more on how do we change the way we do business.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a good segue. I'm glad that you mentioned action, because that sort of leads to my next question, which is sort of how can ESG be integrated into the daily operations of a company? So I've heard you talk about sort of ESG not being something, not being about how profits are spent, but rather how profits are made. So I'm curious sort of what you mean by that. And again, if you have any sort of practical ways that companies can really integrate this into their daily operations and practice.
Well, the first thing I'll say is I love hearing myself quoted back to me. So thank you for that. That was amazing. The way companies can integrate ESG, in a word, strategically. Do not position yourself to do something that you are not able to execute. Start small. So when we think about each company, their competitive advantage, their operations, there's one thing that they can do to start. It's small, typically, it's easy, and it will benefit them strategically. And one thing that is almost universally applicable to LPs, at least, is a waste audit. It does not cost a lot of money to do. In fact, your investment is in a bunch of like clear garbage bags. So max $20, right? Some PPE, and you set aside, a week or a day where your employees are actually separating the waste that they create as part of the manufacturing process, and then you evaluate that waste at the end of the day. That's a waste audit. And in that waste audit, there are people who will buy your spent nylon, meaning your hairnets and your booties. There are people who will buy your spent latex, meaning your gloves. So that is a revenue generation opportunity for the business that currently you're actually paying to get rid of. So not only is it revenue generating, it's also cost saving because you'll have less waste to actually ship out and send to landfill. And so it's this kind of initiative, right? I'm not suggesting that everybody become carbon neutral tomorrow. I don't think that's reasonable. I don't think that will support the profitability of their business, but there are so many things that can be done from a waste perspective, from an energy conservation and efficiency perspective, and from a water conservation and efficiency perspective that actually contribute to the bottom line and help improve margins.
I love that. It's a simple example, but you really sort of lay out like the benefit of doing something like that. And it is, I mean, if you haven't worked on the operations side of the industry, it's really sort of tough to understand like how many Tyvek suits, how many gloves you go through, how many face masks you go through. Like it really is. Anyone who's been in like a cannabis destruction room will kind of know right away like how much stuff just gets like thrown out and never reused, and just it just doesn't seem efficient, right? And
it's absolutely not. And I will give one other example, if I may, just on the biomass side. From a regulatory perspective, we are required to, when we destroy biomass, even if it's stalk and stem, so parts of the plant that typically don't have any active component, no THC, no CBD, when we destroy it, it has to be rendered unrecognizable. And it has to be rendered unrecognizable under the supervision of a QAP, or a responsible person in charge. So that really limits how we've been able to destroy of like basically plant material that is not really eligible for sale at all, meaning that now the standard is to mix that 1-to-1 with kitty litter and then pay to have that removed into landfill. So probably the most wasteful use of biomass that I have ever seen. And by having an on-site, even like a small bioreactor, and there are a couple companies that do this, and one of my favorite is a research company out of Vancouver called Regenerative Waste Labs, but they're developing this small on-site bioreactor. Why is the on-site important? Well, from the security perspective and from a regulatory perspective, you can have all of the necessary people be there. But what's happening in this bioreactor, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic, you can be making fertilizer for your next crop. If you're using anaerobic digestion, you can be creating methane. And that methane, most companies and LPs have a backup generator, can be used to power your backup generator at a time when fuel prices are incredibly high, and you still end up with organic material that you can then use to support the growth of your crops in the future. So having something as simple as a small device that costs less than a few $1,000s sit on your property can save you hundreds of thousands, in the long term.
I'm glad you brought that one up. Like the biomass one is definitely one that you see and like firsthand. And there's different ways of doing that denaturing process. You mentioned sort of kitty litter being the big one. Like I remember at one point we were like putting soil on top, and then we put water on top of that, and then like regular garbage waste like on top, and like that was the process, and it always felt just so
feels wrong.
Yeah, it feels wrong. Exactly. Like it just was not, it was just uncomforting, So, well, speaking of sort of these kind of practices, like how I love grading things. So like how would you score or grade sort of the current state of cannabis industry in terms of sustainability?
Not great. And like very poor, maybe like a D minus. I don't know if you really want to grade. It's from a cultivation, indoor cultivation perspective, we've got a really, really high carbon footprint because of our energy use, mostly driven by lighting and air quality control. Generally, with water, we're quite wasteful because the water isn't really priced correctly for how valuable a resource it is. Then we've got a large amount of actual physical waste that we remove to landfill, largely driven by the PPE requirements from a regulatory perspective. And that's not even touching on any of the packaging waste that we produce as a result of the regulatory requirements.
Yeah, actually great segue there. So that's, I think packaging is oftentimes cited as the biggest culprit when it comes to sustainability and our ability to sort of mitigate waste in the cannabis industry. What I like is that you cover all of these other things as well that go along with it. But to touch on sort of packaging specifically, like what do you see as sort of some of the major hurdles that we face out there in terms of like developing like actual sustainable cannabis packaging? Is it like an attainable goal? Like, have you seen success stories in that area? Like sort of what's holding that back still?
So I'll say two things. Firstly, for every gram of waste that we see as consumers, keep in mind that there are 10 grams of waste that are happening on the manufacturing side. So even though we see like the plastic packaging and we're like, oh my God, 6.4 million kilos were produced in 2019. That increases by a factor of 10 when we look at operational waste. So I'll start there. There are a few things that really are constraining when it comes to our packaging. And the first side of that is, of course, a regulatory thing. We've got a few regulatory requirements. The CR, the child resistant component, means that we're limited in our suppliers that we can choose from because they already have to have this certification, or we have to pay for it ourselves. And that can be like a $30,000 sort of bill. So we're limited in what we can choose. Number two is we have an opacity requirement, meaning that the plastic has to be opaque, and opaque plastic is just less recyclable than clear plastic. It has what we call a lower material conservation rate. So that requirement means that the materials that we're using are less recyclable to begin with. And then on top of that, we've got a smell proof requirement, which means that even if we are using packaging that is potentially more environmentally friendly, like a paper product, we have to cover it in plastic saran wrap, which also ends up in landfill. So those are some regulatory hurdles that we deal with. And on top of that, of course, we've got the labeling requirements, which means that we can't really reach economies of scale with certain types of packaging because everybody wants unique packaging because they can't differentiate themselves on the label itself. And so unlike beer, where almost everybody uses the same bottle, but the labels are unique, and that's what identifies the brand, we can't reach that same economy of scale with our packaging because everybody's trying to differentiate on the size and shape and color of the package because they can do nothing on the label. So yes, some regulatory hurdles, nothing that's insurmountable really. What I think is truly the challenge for all of us is that in our minds, we are still thinking, take, make, waste. We take something, we mine it from the environment, we make it into something, we use it a single time, and then we throw it away. And that is the real problem. Recycling is great. Reuse is better because reuse has a 100% material conservation rate. Plastic, for context, has about 40. Recycling plastic has about a 40% material conservation rate. So when we think about how can we make the biggest possible impact by reducing our contributions to landfill, it's about taking that black plastic jar, collecting it, sanitizing it, and selling it back to the LP. And to be honest, that can be done more cheaply than sourcing a new piece of packaging.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that point, because I think I saw you talk about that recently, where it's like, this is the future isn't like more sustainable plastic necessarily. It's sort of this concept of reuse, right? And that's really like what we need to be pushing forward on more so, right? So I think you touched on it a little bit there, but I think it's interesting in terms of like, what is the answer, right? What is the answer? And is it, do you think it's additional regulations that sort of enforce some of these sustainable rules, or sort of some of these sustainable practices, like actually baked into the regulations themselves? Or is it the fact that maybe we have too much regulation, and then that's limiting sort of people's ability to think outside the box? Like, I think, is this a big dichotomy that we're kind of facing and wrestling with, or is it not that complicated of an issue?
It's absolutely complicated. It is very complicated. I personally am not a believer in bureaucracy, in that I see how wasteful it is from a labor perspective. And I see how governments are run, and they're not the most efficient. So would I advocate at this point in my life, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 50, I don't know, for more regulation? No. What I think is that consumers need to be empowered to have this information at the point of sale. Right now, it's almost impossible for them to find reliable, sort of baseline information about the products that they purchase. And there are two problems with that. One, LPs are not necessarily releasing this information. And two, no consumer is going to research a whole 90-page ESG report and then go shopping based on that information. What they need is apples to apples data at the point of sale, when the credit card is out, when they're about to make that purchase, because most consumers want to make purchasing weed feel like their good deed for the day. They want that. They want to feel good about their purchases. And so what we need, I don't know if there's a regulatory solution to this. I haven't really thought about it that much, but what I have been thinking about it is from a technological perspective. We have a lot of software menus in the industry right now that retailers are leveraging. And there is a certain amount of data that we can gather independently as consumers, like what is the impact of this piece of packaging to the waste stream? I don't need the LP to tell me that. I can look at it. I can know that it's recyclable in my area or not. I can measure what the gram is, and the grams of contribution to waste stream, I mean. And so when we start integrating that information into the menu, LPs are going to come to us and say, well, yeah, my packaging is, 30 grams to landfill, but I do all of these things too that you're not reporting on. Well, why don't you tell me about them? Why don't you use, apples to apples metrics like the IRIS impact metrics, which is from the Global Impact Investing Network, to help me understand what your benefit is. And when you report on those things to me and you give me that information or it's been validated, I'll put it on this menu alongside your contribution to the waste stream. And so what we've seen in the past when it comes to disclosure and consumers and media having access to that information in a digestible way is that companies do the work themselves. Because what happens when reporters and individuals like me get their hands on this information, they start making lists and they start publishing those lists and saying top 10 polluters. And guess what? Nobody wants to be on that list. And so when you start publicizing that information and it's easy to digest, companies automatically do the work, regulation or no regulation.
That's really interesting. And I think like a key point that you're mentioning there is sort of education at the point of sale, right? And really sort of having that dialogue to the consumer so that they understand really what they're purchasing. And like, I didn't find that myself. Like, I don't know if I'm alone here, but like sometimes knowing what you can and can't recycle, like, is actually confusing. And you go on like the Toronto, like City of Toronto website, even if it's like, like I always find this when I'm like trying to throw out my Christmas tree, right? It's
Mhm.
like, how do I live in a condo? So it's like literally impossible to do it. But it's like, there's just like the longest list of like what you can and can't, right? And it becomes tough to sort of disseminate that information. Even too, I use the example of like a pizza box. Like I think for the longest time, I thought a pizza box was recyclable, and then found out like because of like the
Food
grease and the
contamination.
food. Yeah, exactly, right. And that it wasn't. So I think there's even like just basic things like that aren't necessarily that widely known or understood.
And bud tenders don't always have that information. And this is not a complaint about bud tenders, because they are so overwhelmed with the amount of SKUs, things that don't even stay in stock for that long, that they have to learn and then like forget about. So really the staff on the floor is not in a position to be offering this kind of information today, because of the way we sort of saturate the industry with SKUs, and the lack of reliability and supply that we're able to maintain over time. So they're not in a position to offer sometimes even basic information about the product, let alone the product packaging and recycling. So there is a big gap right now in how we are providing education, not just to the consumer, but to the bud tender, because they have right now the short end of the stick.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So important. I really appreciate this conversation. I think ESG is something that I'm hearing more and more about. You have a big part to do with that, at least in my opinion, in terms of this conversation. So I just want to thank you for driving this conversation home, and for giving a bit more context and background to, like I said, what I think is such an important part of the industry. Like as a cannabis industry, I think this is something that we all agree we want to improve on and to be better at. So I really love the fact that you're sort of championing this cause, but also too, like making it palatable, like making it so that, you know, the investor community or the financial side of it can also get on board as well. So I think this is a super important initiative. And I really hope that companies and people reach out to you, because you really do have expertise and advice that I think can really help and benefit the industry. So thank you so much, Mika, for taking the time to speak with me today, but also just sharing your knowledge to the community.
Thank you. And I'm so happy to do that, Connor. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being a supporter of mine on LinkedIn. I'm always trying to provide more information about the things that I'm learning, the things that I come across. And so I'm so happy that you find that valuable, and I hope others do too.
Absolutely. And we'll link down below Mika's LinkedIn, but also to Apical and everything she's doing over there. And so you'll be able to get in touch for anyone who's interested. All right, and so to touch on, you know, final point, how can sort of companies wrap their head around this? What's the easiest way for them to get a better understanding in terms of how they can integrate ESG into their daily operations?
Thanks for that question, Connor. It's a moment where I get to plug myself just a little bit, which is sometimes hard for me to do. But I lead a relevance workshop, and many of you have heard me talk about how relevance is a matter of impact, meaning what we impact and what impacts us, but also influence, where our money, time, and dollars will go farthest. And so when we think about sustainability and social impact initiatives, we have to go through this relevance exercise on a business by business basis, and even sometimes on a project by project basis, to really understand where can we make a real impact in a way that is financially feasible. So you can sign up for my workshop today.
Perfect. Well, we'll have a link to that down below, so definitely check that out. And thank you again, Mika, for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of High Fidelity. For access to the entire Cannabis 360 catalog, subscribe at canna360.ca or visit our YouTube channel, Canna360.